That quaint colonial museum you visited on your school field trip? There was likely a torture chamber hidden beneath it. The pristine, whitewashed history in your textbooks conveniently left out the blood-soaked rooms where thousands suffered unspeakable pain. In this video, I'll show you how colonial powers built elaborate torture facilities right under the noses of ordinary citizens and why these chambers were deliberately erased from our collective memory. Subscribe now to uncover history's darkest secrets. 1. The architecture of pain. That beautiful colonial courthouse you admired? Its basement held cells where prisoners were slowly drowned and revived repeatedly. That's not something your tour guide mentioned, right? Colonial powers didn't just build administrative centers and governors' mansions. They deliberately designed buildings with hidden chambers specifically for torture, often positioned directly beneath or adjacent to government buildings. While elegantly dressed officials conducted business on the upper floors and hosted lavish balls in grand reception rooms, the screams below were methodically muffled by thick stone walls. Colonial architects weren't just concerned with aesthetics and function. They incorporated strategic features to ensure what happened in these chambers remained hidden from both locals and visitors from the homeland. These weren't improvised spaces. Colonial structures included sophisticated soundproofing elements like double walls filled with insulating materials, underground chambers built below the water table to prevent escape tunnels, and isolated wings accessible only through hidden passages. These features appeared in original blueprints, though often labeled with innocuous terms to disguise their true purpose. Architectural historians have found that these chambers contained specialized features normal rooms wouldn't need. Drainage systems in the floors allowed blood to be washed away efficiently. Stone walls featured anchor points for chains and restraints at precise heights. Even the ventilation systems were carefully designed, not for comfort, but to prevent prisoners from suffocating before interrogation was complete. The planning was meticulous and intentional. Colonial records reveal these torture chambers were carefully disguised in official documents. They appeared as special interview rooms, security facilities, or simply storage areas in government paperwork. This deliberate mislabeling wasn't just about secrecy, it was about creating plausible deniability for colonial administrators who could claim ignorance of what happened within their jurisdiction. Some chambers featured removable torture equipment and could be quickly converted into innocent-looking storage rooms. Colonial authorities developed these convertible spaces specifically for when dignitaries or inspectors visited from Europe. The evidence of brutality could disappear within hours, replaced by crates of supplies or furniture. After the inspection, the room would transform back into a place of suffering. The stark contrast between colonial buildings' ornate civilized exteriors and their hidden torture facilities perfectly embodied the dual nature of colonial rule itself. The public face was one of progress and civilization, impressive architecture housing courts, administrative offices, and cultural centers. But beneath this veneer lurked the machinery of oppression that maintained control through systematic terror. So why were these chambers deliberately kept out of our history textbooks? The answer is uncomfortable but clear. They directly contradicted the narrative that colonial powers were bringing civilization to conquered lands. Instead, they revealed a systematic apparatus of terror and control, the real foundation upon which colonial power was built and maintained. The physical evidence hasn't completely disappeared. Those seemingly random sealed doorways in colonial basements, the oddly thick walls that don't align with the rest of the structure, the mysterious drainage systems in places that shouldn't need them. These weren't just architectural quirks or design choices. They're the remaining traces of these chambers that colonial powers tried to erase when they departed. In cities from Latin America to Africa and Asia, local historians have documented these spaces, though their work rarely makes it into mainstream historical narratives. When they give tours, they show the physical modifications, bricked-up passages, filled-in pits, and remnants of restraint systems still visible if you know what to look for. They're preserving the evidence of what really happened in these places, despite centuries of attempted erasure. The architecture of pain wasn't just about inflicting suffering, it was about hiding that suffering from the world. Colonial powers understood that their moral authority depended on concealing the brutal reality of how they maintained control. These buildings weren't just functional spaces, they were physical manifestations of a massive historical deception that continues to shape how we understand the colonial era today. The bureaucracy of brutality. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect wasn't the tools themselves, but how torture became integrated into routine colonial governance. Torture wasn't an exceptional activity carried out by sadistic individuals. It was procedural, a standard administrative practice with its own protocols, documentation, and quality control. Just as colonial officials kept records of tax collection and agricultural yields, they tracked the effectiveness of various torture methods, creating a bureaucracy of brutality that systematized human suffering in the name of imperial control. Colonial torture wasn't carried out by rogue actors acting on dark impulses. It operated as a systematically documented process, complete with its own bureaucratic language. Officials recorded torture sessions in official reports using sanitized terms like enhanced questioning, pressure techniques, and special methods, euphemisms that obscured the violent reality of what happened in those chambers. Colonial powers constructed elaborate bureaucratic systems around torture that mirrored their other administrative functions. Chains of command were structured so that responsibility was deliberately diffused across multiple levels. These systems included formal authorization procedures, documentation protocols, and even performance reviews. Pain was administered with the same administrative precision used to manage colonial budgets and road construction. The same meticulous record-keeping used in commerce and agriculture applied to torture. Colonial archives contain thousands of pages of torture-related paperwork, rarely labeled as such. Instead, these records hide behind neutral-sounding department names and coded language. When modern historians examine these documents, they find a disturbing level of clinical detachment in descriptions of human agony. Colonial administrators regularly analyzed the efficiency of different torture methods. Reports included data on how quickly subjects responded, how reliable their answers were, and how long it took to recover between sessions. Officials even proposed improvements to interrogation protocols, treating torture not as a moral horror but as a problem of administrative optimization. Some empires went even further by establishing formal training programs for interrogators. Instruction manuals detailed approved methods, psychological tactics, and even sample scripts. These guides included anatomical diagrams highlighting pressure points and thresholds for injury. Circulated between colonies, they standardized torture across continents, a global knowledge exchange of pain. Authorization forms for special interrogation were common in many colonial systems. They required multiple signatures, creating the illusion of oversight and moral deliberation. In reality, this paper trail served to disperse accountability and shield individual actors from responsibility, all while portraying torture as a tightly controlled, lawful process. Colonial legal systems also created special prisoner classifications that justified extreme measures, often based on race or political affiliation. These categories stripped indigenous resistance leaders and suspected revolutionaries of legal protections. Entire ethnic groups could be legally designated as subject to extraordinary measures, making systemic abuse not just accepted, but authorized. Interrogation results were cataloged and studied with cold precision. Officials compiled statistics on success rates, shared best practices between outposts, and held conferences to exchange findings. This wasn't disorganized brutality. It was organized, documented, and constantly refined to maximize control. How did colonial authorities justify all this? Through bureaucratic ritual. Chains of command, stamped forms, and official reviews turned acts of violence into paperwork. These systems allowed colonial officials to view torture not as cruelty, but as a necessary tool of governance, detached from personal guilt and framed as a function of civil administration. Perhaps the most chilling part of this bureaucracy of brutality is how ordinary it all looked. Requisition forms for torture instruments were filed alongside requests for office supplies. Interrogation progress reports sat beside harvest projections. Reports evaluating torture efficiency used the same format as those measuring tax compliance. In these colonial systems, torture wasn't the exception. It was embedded in the machinery of rule. The legacy of this system lives on. The architectural designs that hid torture chambers influenced modern prison construction. The bureaucratic processes that normalized cruelty evolved into contemporary security institutions. And the psychological scars inflicted through these systems still haunt communities today. Understanding these hidden histories isn't about blaming the past. It's about confronting the systems and ideologies we've inherited. The sanitized stories we learned erased these horrors for a reason, but the record exists if you're willing to look. Subscribe for more hidden histories and leave a comment sharing which aspect of colonial torture chambers shocked you the most.